I've always thought it's my responsibility to figure out how do I pull together my team members and empower them through a project to help me change processes, change environments, improve their work life.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales.
Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
And welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartmann. On this podcast, we connect with construction industry leaders from across the country to share their insights on leadership, as you may have anticipated, personal improvement, and to share practical, tactical tips to help you build trust faster and lead more persuasively. Our guest is one Mr. Gary Kaplan. He is the president of North America Construction at AXA XL Insurance. Gary has over 40 years of insurance expertise and has been in construction risk leadership roles for over 30 years. Gary oversees the #1 property and casualty commercial lines platform and services over 90% of the Fortune 500 and an overwhelmingly large percentage of the ENR 100. Gary is passionate about leadership, and he's been writing about the craft of leadership for years. In preparing for this interview, I stumbled upon his leadership article from February 2014 titled, "Not Another Leadership Article." And apart from being a candid, no-nonsense article perfect for young underwriters or newly minted VPs alike, his style comes through loud and clear. Gary writes like he speaks, and it is concise and direct, and it is fun to read and, as you'll hear, fun to listen to as well. Gary Kaplan is a Husky, graduating from Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, where he studied chemistry. And we discussed some of the lessons he still applies today about multidisciplinary thinking from his days working around beakers and Bunsen burners. What I found most helpful from this conversation is the continuous improvement projects that are, well, continuously underway at AXA XL under Gary's leadership. He calls it project-based leadership, and we dig into the fundamentals of how he leads the efforts and how it helps develop future leaders while instilling a sense of urgency and accomplishment every quarter of every year. As he'll say, there is no finish line. So as always, thank you for listening. I believe you'll very much enjoy my conversation with Mr. Gary Kaplan, president of North America Construction at AXA XL Insurance. So Mr. Gary Kaplan, welcome to the show. Thank you. Now, I appreciate you making time for this. When insurance got on your radar, for most folks I've just anecdotally heard, it kind of just fell into their lap, or they knew someone and then they had an opportunity and then they got into it and loved it and stayed in it for a long time. How did you end up in insurance? It was not by choice. So, okay. I was always amazed when my dad would come back from Ottawa, Illinois, or places out in the middle of Illinois, and he'd come back with these giant wads of cash. People would actually pay him their life insurance premiums with cash and a handwritten receipt. And, he taught me how to count the money, and that probably caught my attention at an early age. I can imagine.
But I wasn't thinking that I was going to take chemistry to go to work in insurance. Industrial risk insurers, which is the first place I worked, came to NIU, and I just took the interview for practice. They were looking for science majors because they insured a lot of the oil and the chemical companies. And they made me a great offer. I was like, I got to go to a different plant every day. It was like work at home with your company car, and it was a pretty good starting salary. So I said, well, I'll try this for a while.
Okay.
I'll get to see chemistry on a large scale,
for sure,
basically. And I did that for 3 years, and I just loved it.
I was going to ask you about, and you think of your team and in a leadership role, motivating and incentivizing your team when part of the work and many of the jobs, these are, for a lack of a better term, these are cube jobs, right? Mm-hmm. So in what ways do you help motivate your team to get them involved and get them thinking maybe a little differently and not falling into maybe just the humdrum atmosphere of just coming into work, doing the same thing every day and not really bringing their entire cognitive abilities to the job?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it does translate well from my background in chemistry. I really did like the whole notion of coming up with a theory and proving or disproving it. So then I started to get in projects, as I went through college, and then coming out at IRI, I reviewed projects. So once I got into a leadership job, I could see the power of projects. I always liked being on them, and a couple of times I got to lead them, and it really propelled my career. So I've always thought it's my responsibility to figure out how do I pull together my team members and empower them through a project to help me change processes, change environments, improve their work life. We don't ask them to do that all year long, but I try to get everybody involved in one project one time a year for like 90 days. And I think that's really been incredibly important. It brings to life a lot of the theories around leadership where, you're supposed to set a good vision, you're supposed to empower people, you're supposed to hold them accountable. A project does all of that. Yeah. It's the perfect vehicle to deliver on what you're supposed to do as a leader.
Yeah. And I can imagine, obviously, being in the construction industry, that translates really well to the different phases there. I think this is a good jumping off point. Do you mind if we maybe nerd out just a little bit? You showed me kind of your 2x2 grid, looking at urgency versus value, and the process you go through, you described as project-based leadership. Can we dig into that just a little bit and kind of how you go about doing that with your team?
Yeah, 20 years ago, I got introduced to this process to do projects. It's called Rapid Results Initiatives, RRIs. It's a real simple project process. It's very much results focused. You limit the scope to 90 days. You pull a team together. You as the sponsor challenge the team to help you figure out an opportunity, solve an issue, fix a process. The key is you challenge the team to help you do that. You empower them to come up with the solution. But you also push them to come up with a goal where they're going to really create some kind of a result within that 90-day period. It forces them to start doing things quickly. It gets them focused on generating that result in 90 days.
Okay. 2 questions. How big are those teams and how do those teams form? Are they self-selected or are you, go back to chemistry, are you kind of mixing and matching to see how different teams will operate?
Like any team you pull together, it's based upon what the issue is, what's the opportunity. That's how you pick the team members. Probably the most important person to pick is the team leader.
Sure.
And I usually rely on picking people that I want to test as in their leadership capabilities, help them develop those capabilities. Once you pick the team leader, then you get together, and picking the team members is really the easiest part. It's usually very logical. Okay. If you're doing it geographically based, you kind of tap into the people that are there. If it's a virtual team, then you kind of pick people from various areas based upon what they're going to bring to the equation. We try to make them really diverse. I think the whole diversity and inclusion is a big waste unless you could figure out how to get those people involved in projects, because that's the whole notion of diversity and inclusion. You get a better outcome if you have the luxury of time to get their opinions involved in the ultimate decision. And every project is really a decision, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you're deciding to do things, change things, improve things.
I think there's a deep insight there that on the surface I think is obvious, but I see on different teams where I'll be with clients or other companies that I'm involved with, and I'll see that they're touting their diversity and inclusion. They'll talk about how we're really trying to mix it up. And then you get on the project level or a team, you see it's a bunch of middle-aged white guys who half of them went to the same university. And you're like, hey, I know all these people work here. And you should be proud of that. It's good. But if it's not at the team level, that's how you fall into this group think in the first place. So again, how big are these teams, by the way, generally?
I define a project when I do this operational plan as it's 3 people or more for 3 weeks or more. That, to me, takes out all the other stuff that's just assignments, really.
Sure.
And I don't want assignments on this. I'm really focused on projects. The teams tend to be around 10.
Okay.
I think that's probably the perfect size. You get to 15 to 20, those teams don't function very well.
Yeah.
It's like herding cats. So I'd say 6 to 10 is probably the perfect size.
Okay. So on your team of roughly about 100, how many active projects do you have now? We're at the beginning of the year. How many projects are on your plate?
Yeah, we typically, at the end of the year and at the end of October, after our financial plan's done, I pull together our extended leadership team. We come together for 2 days and we develop the operational plan, which is the 2x2.
It is. Okay.
It's a portfolio of projects that we're going to use throughout the year to stimulate performance, change processes, continually improve, help the underwriters, the risk engineers, the claims people, the actuaries, help them hit their goals. Okay. The projects actually stimulate performance. They are given the ability to try things out that they probably wouldn't have done had we brought them together. And ultimately, that helps them hit their objectives for that year. We end up I have 5 profit centers under me, so 5 different groups of people. We end up typically with about 50 projects a year.
Gotcha. And what are the levers that you're evaluating that are, I imagine, a certain project? This project could really drive, top line growth, or this one could really maybe improve a process that is still kind of cumbersome.
For me, the 4 classic levers to pull, those are the projects.
Okay. Yep.
Would be growth, profitability, expense or productivity.
Okay.
And the last one is talent. You always wanted to be developing your talent.
Yeah.
So we break it into those 4 levers.
Okay. Do you have an example, without getting too specific or as much as you'd like to, on a project that would focus on talent?
So all of them are focused on talent. That one's actually pretty easy. Okay. If you think about it, the whole, if you listen to any people in education, experiential learning is so much more powerful than listening to me talk on a webinar. Yeah. So all the projects are that. So I think the talent one is just, it's a natural thing for the projects. A growth one would be a good example of a growth project. Say I hire a new underwriter in Los Angeles and we've never been there before. So that's the first person we have in that region. What I'll do is I'll do a growth project around that new underwriter. Okay. And I'll bring in people from the other 4 lines of business that'll meet in that new region with that new person, and together they'll focus on growing that new business in that region for the next 90 days. Okay. It accomplishes a bunch of things. That new person gets to meet everybody else on the team. Sure. They get to understand what everybody else brings to the equation. They get to leverage their relationships that may exist in that region. The other members of the team get to leverage the local person's relationships. And typically we have huge success at kicking off a new city by bringing in that growth focus project. We've done that over the last 10 years literally across the country.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm thinking right now as you're talking just about my own team and these big projects that we have and chunking them into 90 days. So we don't get too far ahead though. The 2x2 grid is urgency on the y-axis, and then you have importance or value on the x-axis. And at first my thought was, well, why would a project even fall into low urgency and low importance or value? And then I took a step back and was like, well, obviously these are all important, but it's a way to prioritize.
Exactly.
And I still struggle to call myself a consultant, but that's what I am. As a consultant, I love the last refuge of a consultant is a 2x2 grid. What happens maybe within a team where you have a whole bunch that's, oh, this is really urgent and this is extremely valuable, Gary? What happens when they all bunch in the top right corner?
I just draw a line through it. I create a new 2x2 in that quadrant. And
okay.
The reality is, an important thing to do with any leadership team is to agree on how are you going to utilize the limited resources you have. And everybody has that problem. Yeah. Nobody gets all the people they want and all the dollars they want. So you always have to figure out how are you going to utilize the limited time and energy that you can get out of your people. Mm-hmm. So the process of going through this operational plan, which is the 2x2, is magic, because now the members of my leadership team collectively agree these are the 50 projects we're going to do, and this is how they stack up against one another. Yeah. And there's very little fighting around that. At the end of the day, people are pretty reasonable, and they realize that, where they put the thing doesn't mean they're going to get funded or unfunded or supported or unsupported. We create the portfolio of projects at the end of the year as a place to go and launch projects as we execute on the plan that following year. Okay. Every quarter, we're trying to come up with probably 10 different projects to launch that will stimulate growth, improve profitability, make us more productive, and develop our people.
Okay. Anything you learned along the way when someone might have, I don't say their feelings hurt, or maybe got demotivated because something that was a high priority and had a lot of resources and attention maybe in Q1 business is dynamic and things change. And by Q3, that got slid down. How do you go about managing that to making sure we don't accidentally demotivate people on certain projects?
So, I like any leadership team, I have my people come together. I do it twice in a month. We have a virtual call the third Monday of every month. I've done 106 of those in a row. And that's everybody on the team. That's my team and everyone that supports. Okay. We stop for 45 minutes. We have a really good routine on how we communicate. We talk about the new talent. We talk about the financials. Where are we at? What are the metrics telling us? Each of the 5 profit center leaders has 5 minutes to talk about what's going on in their business.
It's like a shot clock.
I time them.
You do? Okay.
That's a really good tip. If you want to keep meetings on time, you tell people they got 5 minutes and you use your stopwatch.
Yeah.
And my senior boss, the guy that runs AXA XL, he has a duck quacking thing now. He really liked the idea, so now his phone starts quacking. And that shuts people up. It's very effective.
I can imagine, yeah.
But, we run that meeting every month, and it's really important. I follow that up right after that, after lunch, with a staff meeting for about an hour. And we always go through the operational plan during that staff meeting. We said, what are the metrics telling us? Does the portfolio look right for this quarter? Are we doing the right projects, or should we be shifting things around? If we're way ahead on the growth side, we push the growth projects back. Okay. We make them a lower priority. If somebody's struggling on profitability, we rush to do more profitability projects.
Got it.
So, you got to have a good set of metrics, and we use the virtual call as a way of communicating those metrics. Literally everybody on our team knows where we're at. There's some magic in that too. Yeah. There's also magic in having people report to 160 people because they're ready.
They better be ready.
They're ready.
Yeah, a lot of pressure on that.
There's a lot of pressure, and it's great. That's also a really good talent development. People need to learn how to present.
Yeah.
And they need to learn how to present within the time frame they're given, because the more and more responsibility you get, the less and less time you get to make those pitches.
Yeah.
And we've got this ridiculous engagement score. We had an engagement score 2 years ago of 91% of the team was engaged. We had 8 that was neither engaged or disengaged, and we had less than 1% disengaged. And I thought to myself, what is that? That's crazy. I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah, because I know that I always keep track of that, the Gallup score they do, and I think across all industries in the U.S., it's like 23% is actively disengaged. Like they are rowing deliberately against the way the boat is headed.
Right.
You know?
And now at AXA, we did net promoter score here this last go around, and we came back with 65, which is pretty ridiculous. I mean, they say 10 is really, really, really good.
Yeah, and net promoter scores, you're asking your customers what percentage of them basically highly recommend you, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So I tried to figure. I asked the team. I pulled the extended leadership team together at the end of October to do the operational plan. We had a session. I said, I want to know why our scores are so high. What do you guys think is driving it? And they pointed to a few things. They pointed to this model, that we do things very consistently throughout the year. They know we're going to launch projects, so we're always fixing things. We're always improving people's working environment through the projects.
Right.
If you're always fixing process, things get better. Mm-hmm. It's really ironic that the business leaders I've worked with that complain the most about how their people don't have any more time to do projects are the same ones that never fix any of their processes.
Right.
It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you never change anything because you never launch any projects, things don't magically get better for the people that are sitting in the cubes.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that with all these projects, and I know many of them are continuous improvement, but I see with a lot of the clients that we work with, we are much more apt to add something, add it to the pile. We're going to do this and this. And they're a little more reticent to say, you know what, we're not doing that anymore. How often do these initiatives result in us stop doing this or doing this 90% less?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Brad. The growth lever and the profitability lever usually focus on doing something that you weren't doing or doing it differently.
Okay.
So if you just do those, it's going to accumulate into more things. Yep. More spreadsheets for underwriters, more check boxes for risk engineers. But if you add that third lever, the expense lever, the productivity lever, that's how you bring the processes back to an efficient point.
Okay.
And we do that literally every year. We've done that 10 years in a row. It's usually in the first quarter. we'll go and we'll look at the process of the underwriters, the risk engineers, the claims handlers. We'll pull together a small team with a rapid results initiative. We'll review the existing process, and we'll challenge them to say, all right, what are you doing that doesn't add value that we can have somebody else do? We want to use your brain to the utmost. We want to use your fingers less.
Right.
So we've got something called the middle office here at AXA XL. That's what used to be called underwriting assistance.
Okay, sure.
So we're always looking to transfer those tasks from the underwriters to the middle office, and then we do the same thing with the middle office. They transfer tasks to a giant team we have in India.
Okay.
I have about 35 people in India that support me that are doing the work that used to be done by our underwriters, our risk engineers, and our claims handlers.
And how long have you been doing that?
Since the beginning.
So what, like 2010, 2011?
2010 is when I started, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I got reprimanded. I was doing purchasing work, and I realized there's just some tasks that basically anyone else could do. And I just finished the book called The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss. And he talked about hiring this company in India called Brickwork to basically do the same thing, shove these tasks lower. So I was like, let's try this. So I did that, and I started just feeding this, and I was just paying them, and it was like, I don't know, $10 an hour or something. It was really cheap. It was very effective, and then I made the mistake of telling one of my coworkers, and then word got around that I was offshoring my own work responsibilities, and they were not fans of that. How did you come about doing this, and what have you learned with appropriating work to India, where obviously different culture, maybe language barriers, maybe with a smaller, large, what have you learned throughout that process?
So the magic to me is the middle office.
Okay.
So when you try to offshore a process that's not consistent, you're dead. You're dead. And literally the way we build underwriting teams, we hire people from different companies, right?
Yeah.
They all bring in their process from their company.
Oh, sure.
So you get complete inconsistency across the country. If you don't standardize what the underwriter's doing before you transfer it to the middle office, it fails. Yeah. And if middle office doesn't standardize it before they transfer it to India, it fails. I think going through those steps, going through that process and making sure that you really have it clearly defined, this is the way it's going to get done, it makes it work really well. We've had literally no issues, which I'm kind of surprised, but I showed you earlier that we've gone from an average premium per underwriter of about $4.5 million to over 12.
Gotcha. And remind me, what time period was that? Or what duration?
The first policy was written in 2011. So
let's stick on culture for a moment. How do you develop a strong culture? And having met many people of your team, they're smart, they're funny, they're guys you want to hang out with. How do you make sure when you have a team that's working all over the country, develop this common culture when they're not seeing each other every day?
So there's a few things that I think our culture is strong for a few reasons. We try to screen out people we don't like.
Okay.
I have a name for that. I won't use it on your podcast, but there's a book written about it, several of them. I completely adopted that methodology.
The no a-hole rule?
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
We don't hire them, we don't insure them, and we don't work with them. Okay. So that everyone likes that. Yep. I mean, I've had people come to me and say, this customer is an a-hole. And I said, well, give me an example, and they'll tell me what they went through. And if it's unacceptable to me and them, we don't renew that account. Yep. I mean, I think that's a really, really important part of the culture. So we get the right people in. We do tend to have fun. So we try to figure out how to make it light. The virtual calls, people are laughing a lot. I mean,
you got the duck quack going as the shot clock.
Just little things like that. I think the way we performance management is very coaching. More. Okay. It's not trying to get people. We've been very successful, so that helps too. I mean, people like to be on a winning team, but we also we look for opportunities to celebrate. Literally, we're coming up on $4 billion written in 10 years, and we stop at every billion. Everybody takes a half day off. We always get shirts. I have everybody in every city do something, and then we have a contest. They have to. I love pictures. So they have to take photos of whatever it is they're doing, and they stream them all back to me, and then we pick out the one that's the best. First year was the 1 billion. So remember Austin Powers, Dr. Evil. So sure. I had everybody trying to come up with the best Dr. Evil look, and a guy named Ray Allen was the guy that won on our team. He could make his eyebrow go up, which I can't do.
That's awesome. How do you think through kind of that coaching and the culture piece and separating when things don't go well, we have a failure or something underachieved, whether it's a project or anything else, how do you separate the bad decisions maybe that are up front versus a less than optimal outcome? How do you separate the decision from the outcome?
So you're always looking for bad decisions. I mean, that's your responsibility ultimately as the chief underwriting officer, which I guess I am at running the business. And you know, whenever we have a big claim, I try to make sure that we didn't make really bad decisions. So far, that hasn't happened very often. We've not let many people go, and literally hardly anybody's left. So we've had very little turnover. Yeah. So, you know, we haven't had a whole lot of examples. We've had a couple of big claims. I mean, you know,
it's going to happen.
They're in the news. And what I like to do is when those happen is I get on the phone right away with senior leadership and I tell them what we got and what we know we got. I pull the team together. I say, well, how are we going to respond? And I try to get them actually to focus on the response to the claim and not get caught up in the fact that we had a big claim. Mm-hmm. Everybody feels bad after a big claim. Right. I'll never forget, you know, the first account I wrote as an underwriter in 1988 was Phillips Petroleum.
Okay.
This was the biggest onshore explosion ever. That was my first account. I'll never forget how bad I felt. Literally, my first account. I blew through the whole limit. It was a $1.4 billion
No pun
claim.
intended. You blew through it.
And I'll never forget how I felt. So I try to not make people feel bad because they already do when they have a claim.
Right.
So I try to focus it on the positives. At my former company, after Katrina, and I was responsible for all property at that time, and we had a gigantic loss. And I felt awful, and I had to go in there and tell him how big I thought it was. And I'll never forget what he did. You know, I kind of thought I was going to get fired because it was that big. It was billions of dollars, right, potentially.
Yeah.
And he said, you know what? We're going down to New Orleans next month. We're taking the whole leadership team down there, and we're going to show that city how to adjust claims. And I thought, wow. I mean, I never forgot that. And I took that away. And what do you get from that? I mean, ultimately, your customers want you to respond to claims. That's what they're buying.
Absolutely. Right.
So just when you have a bad one, just get over it and do the best you can to make it into something good.
Yeah. There's a classic story about Jack Welch at GE when he was coming up, and he had a guy who reported to him in his early days of leadership, and the guy blew up a lab and almost killed people. And they thought the total value of it was about $25 million. And he got on an earnings call or something, the question came up was, all right, have you fired this guy? He goes, fired him. He goes, I just taught him a $25 million lesson.
I've heard that one.
You know, and I'm like, it's those things, and especially as leaders, when something bad happens and how you react, not only in the short term and the long term, I think those lessons, you know, really stay with folks. I do want to ask you, XL Kaplan, now AXA XL. What have you learned through mergers and acquisitions? What are some of the lessons you've taken away about really how to maintain harmony and keep people really focused when things like that happen? Because a lot of times that change management process slows everybody down because they're concerned about themselves and what changes, as opposed to, again, taking that next step and moving forward.
Yeah, so I fall back on the projects.
Okay.
I mean, literally, that happened in the Kaplan thing, and we got everybody together, said, what can we do collectively that's better than what we're doing independently?
Sure.
So focusing on projects is what I would naturally fall towards. I think that usually works in integration. You know, I've been on a couple of executive teams where the biggest challenge of a chief executive officer, and they call them that for a reason, they're managing people that typically don't work together. Yeah. They're the boss of the executives.
Right.
And it's hard to get them to work on things because they're busy off running their own things.
Right.
The real power of those teams comes when you can figure out how to match them up, focusing on problems, initiatives, challenges. And my boss, Joe Tacos, did a great job of that right now. He's figured out how to get us focused collectively on certain things during the year that force the executive leadership team to work together to try to solve something across our businesses instead of independently.
Okay.
I think if you could do the same thing when you bring together two companies, that's going to be way more powerful. People are never the same after they work on a successful team together.
Right.
I mean, it's really unbelievable. I remember every single person I worked with after 9/11. You know, I was in charge of the response to terrorism, which basically was not excluded in any policies anywhere in the United States.
Yeah.
And the TRIA was being enacted. We had 3 weeks, literally 3 weeks, to become compliant with TRIA, and we had 85 underwriting workstations that had to be changed. That's impossible. Mm-hmm. I'll never forget, I got that assignment and it scared the heck out of me. Scariest thing I've ever gotten. And I just literally freaked out, and I just grabbed all the people that I knew I would need and told them they needed to be there the next morning. And we met every morning for 3 weeks, and you know what? We got it done. And I stay in touch with every one of those people because it's a life-changing event when you're on a project like that. They're not all that dramatic, but successful projects are awesome. Unsuccessful projects are equally awesome because you usually learn something right away that you wouldn't have known had you not done the project.
Sure.
And we shut them down. I mean, I won't say which project it was, but I had one that was in a geography where, lo and behold, it was integrating the two teams, right, that had just come together. And that was my idea, is how to make that work. Well, the team leader decides to quit. Okay. That's always a bad sign when you lose a team leader. Then my project manager goes to a different company. I lost the two most important people on a project. I tried to replace them with other people. The next call, that next week, I could sense that thing was going nowhere. I killed it right there.
Okay.
And then we came back a quarter later and we tried it again. We had a very successful launch.
Gotcha. And in that example, that it was a 90-day project. It was. Okay.
They're all 90 days.
They're all 90 days.
Teams will, that's an interesting thing because teams will always want more time.
Right.
That's a natural tendency.
Sure.
And they'll want to broaden the scope. That's always a mistake because the more scope creep you get on a project, the less likely you're going to be successful. And if you let them stretch it out, it reduces the urgency. The more time you have, the less urgency. It's like annual goals. There's no urgency. This week right now, if I'm sitting in my cube as an underwriter,
51 weeks. I'm
not too worried right now. Right. But if you chunk it into 90-day sprints, then you up the urgency. And the more time you give, the worse it is. So I'd say that's always a rule of thumb. Another thing about rapid results initiatives, you're changing processes, you're trying new things, you're experimenting, and usually the team hits the goal, gets close to the goal, or exceeds the goal. Sometimes they're just under it. Sometimes they don't get it at all. But the real power comes after the project's over. Because, so say I'm going for $3 million in some city that I'm just starting out. I may or may not get that in 90 days, but the things they do during that 90-day period, they're there forever. Yeah. So the real value comes in the quarters after the project's over because you get that improvement forever.
Yeah. Do you have any standard process to kind of do, whether it's a post-mortem or some way to look at that experience and say, before we jump into a new project or get back to, my goals that are going to take the next 3 quarters, to really make sure we spend a little time and wallow and see if we can't, extract an insight from this?
So we don't do a project without having that end. The two most important things in my mind are the launch.
Yep.
Can you really get people excited during the launch?
Yep.
And then at the end, do you give them the opportunity to tell you, this is what we did, here's what we found out, here's how successful we were. I actually take those teams, the ones that do really well, and I have them present during the virtual call. So they get to present what they did to their peers. And then the ones that are really good, I take up to my team's meeting, Joe Taco's group, and they present to the rest of North America's leadership team. Okay. People like that. I mean, team leaders that are doing a really good job, getting that kind of spotlight on them, very powerful.
Yeah, and I imagine you learn a lot too, because there could be a really good project that is done well, but you find that individual is not the person who really, they don't want to really be the face of it when in front of maybe all the executives. But I can only imagine you just learn so much about the individual people that you're just kind of filing away for future leadership opportunities. And again, to your point, always coming back to kind of developing that talent.
There's a lot of people that don't like to present because they're scared to death of it. Right. Those are the ones you have to make present. Right. Because you get over it. I was that person. I'll never forget how scared I was of making presentations. That's why I went to chemistry, literally.
Yeah. Well, and I was one of the people who was on the opposite side. It's like, I love to present. I got a lot to talk about. You find out there's a real risk in there, the overconfidence, and that if you run your mouth long enough, an insight might pop out as opposed to being very methodical and presenting a story that everyone's kind of nodding their head to. I think there's, you can be on It's a risk to be on either one of those ends of that spectrum.
You learn things from really good bosses and really bad bosses, right?
Yeah.
And I had one that took credit for everything that we did. And you never forget what that feels like.
Right.
And I always try not to be a hypocrite. So I always kind of gone the other way. I ran a spotlight, actually, when I was in grade school. I was the guy in the back of the auditorium that worked the spotlight. So I've always had this probably love of putting the spotlight on people, and I like to do that through the projects.
No, you're right. And I would say one of my earliest best boss was a guy named Ed Dowdy, and he was so consistent in front of bosses, in front of everyone, of deflecting all the credit. And it was like we had a really great team. We had some great results. And he would consistently, it's like, it's not me. You guys gave me all the talent, and constantly deflect that. And to this day, I mean, that's almost 20 years ago. I still think of that. As I'm watching the clock here, thinking about time and your own productivity, are there certain things you do consistently to making sure that you, as an executive, are using your time really wisely when lots of people, including myself, are trying to distract you to get you in front of a microphone and talk, and maybe some things that you've learned along the way in terms of your own productivity?
Two things that I could think of. So there was one period in my career where I had my admin scheduling my day, literally every minute of every day. And that's what it turned into. So I was a machine at going from one meeting to the other, and there was never any time to do anything. There was never any time to actually think.
Right.
So I'd get home, and I'd be going through 8 meetings, because I had 8 more coming the next day, So I killed that. The first phase was I changed the default in Lotus Notes, is what we were using back then, from an hour to 45 minutes, because that gave me 15 minutes. And you know how meetings last as long as you schedule them for. And then I went to 30 minutes. And I said, then I stopped her from scheduling the thing at all, and I took that on myself. So I control my calendar.
Yeah. That's
the number one thing, I think. You don't let somebody else do that. I'm always looking for something that can improve the workday. And literally about a year and a half ago, I found somebody through one of our employees, Chris Adrian. This guy, his name's Steve Turner, teaches you how to use the software that's already on your computer or on your tablet or on your smartphone. And if you think about it, when's the last time you had any training on any of that?
Never.
Exactly. And guess what Microsoft and Apple are doing every year? Making stuff really easy.
Right.
And we just don't know about it.
Yeah.
And this guy specializes, and he's fabulous. He's literally training everybody in our company right now. He promises you an hour a day, and he's giving me way more than that.
Gotcha. What's the guy's name?
Steve Turner.
Steve Turner.
His company's called Turner Time. They're right here in Rockford, Illinois. And it's very affordable, and it's shocking when he starts showing you some of the shortcuts that exist on existing software you've paid for. It's just unbelievable. And I've had him come to a bunch of the construction conferences. So, AGC, he was at ERMI this last year.
Okay.
So, I'm spreading the wealth even to my competitors, because there's nothing more frustrating than to be that busy and then to find out that you could have done this one thing that would have saved you 10 or 15 minutes.
Absolutely. All right. Turner Time. We'll check that out. I want to ask you in the future sometime. I wanted to get to it, but we were rolling on kind of your ecosystem. But I want to ask you, what technology do you think that we're going to see standard in construction that we're seeing now? Maybe it's around, but fast forward, whether it's 3 or 5 years, this is going to be really standard. It's really going to change the way we think and act on the job site.
Yeah, we are doing a really cool project right now. Probably the coolest one I've been on in a long, long time. We're calling it the construction ecosystem, but it's trying to figure out how to make sense of all of the digitalization that's available now on a project. And it's coming fast. I mean, we interview 2 or 3 companies a week that are doing this, and some of them are new, some of them are more mature, and they're all independent. And the more and more I thought about it, I started out in '79 with IRI in the highly protected risk space. That's what we called it. And back then, my job was to go out to the risk and make sure that it was highly protected, that it was really monitored well. Construction was right. They had sprinklers with water flow alarms and central stations and all that stuff. And when those guys qualified for highly protected risk, they got a big discount on their insurance.
Okay.
So back then it was worthwhile to put in sprinklers. I mean, the codes didn't force you that much to do it back then, so we had to convince people to do that. That has never happened on projects. Really, there's never been what I would call a highly protected project.
You mean there hasn't been enough incentives for them to go over invest in a certain area?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
You look at you go out to projects all the time. It's not that much different than when I was doing it 40 years ago. I mean, there's certainly more safety equipment, right? There's more people checking quality. There's more people checking progress, and it's kind of manual still. I mean, people with tablets. I mean, they got tablets. They didn't have those 40 years ago. But there's all this stuff now that we could put on a project through drones, through cameras, through atmospheric monitoring, through employee monitoring.
Sensors you can put on everything.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
There's going to come a point where that's going to consolidate down and you will have a packet, we're calling it a tech stack.
Okay.
But a group of technologies that you put on that project that will improve everything about it, the quality, the timeliness, the schedule, the budget. It'll drive down the loss ratios.
Gotcha.
That's going to come. It's coming very fast. I'm convinced it'll happen in my career.
Gotcha. Well, I love the idea of a tech stack of where you're doing the heavy lifting for them to say this combination of technology, because a lot of times for my GC clients, we kind of look at them as one at a time, and then it's constant adoption of new singular technology as opposed to, I love that idea of tech stack. 2 last questions for you. Do you have anything that is on your not to-do list? We kind of touched on this as a team, but about you personally, it's easy to have your to-do list. Anything on your not to-do list?
Yeah, I mentioned a couple of them, but a long time ago when I moved from being a pretty good manager to a leader, I studied leadership. I mean, you could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many books. I mean, I just gave you 2 new ones, right?
Did? Yeah.
There are so many leadership books. And I started studying them, and it was about the year 2000. And the big shift for me between manager and leader was to step away from stuff, actually trust people to kind of do things, right? And that's a hard move, because when you get to be a successful manager, you're leading teams, you're doing things right, and you think that's the reason you're winning. And you haven't figured out yet that you can do that same thing with other people and bring out the best in other people. So I really go out of my way to avoid micromanagement. When I see people doing that, I see poor results. So I think that's the one thing. And then the other thing I mentioned was I really go out of my way never to be a hypocrite. So when I say stuff like on this podcast that'll be out there forever,
right.
I mean it. I try not to do the opposite of what I'm saying. I mean, this is what I believe in, and I try to always say, don't say one thing and then do the opposite, because people, then they don't trust you, and then your leadership diminishes.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate this. My mind's been working on some projects with my own team, and we're going to apply those, and you gave me 2 books to help me do that. So I want to say thank you. Appreciate your time.
Okay. Great talking to you. Appreciate it.
All right. As always, thank you for listening. I hope you found my conversation with Mr. Gary Kaplan to be worth your time and attention. Now, at the end of every episode, we will recommend a book or a podcast or article, some piece of content that we believe will help you become a more thoughtful and intelligent leader. The recommendation for today's episode is Abstract, the Art of Design, that can be found on Netflix.
What's important is the story, the message, the feeling, the connection. It's design.
You go, oh my God, how am I going to solve this problem?
I really want to affect as many people as possible.
Honestly, nobody wants authenticity.
Tastemaking takes time. So if you get it wrong, you get it really wrong.
It's the best storytelling product we've ever done.
It was widely discussed that I had pushed it too far.
Now, I stumbled across season 1 of Abstract, the Art of Design, a couple years ago in 2017. And in the matter of like 2 days, I pounded through every single one of the episodes. The episode on shoe design featuring Tinker Hatfield, the guy who designed pretty much all the iconic Jordans of the past 30 years, was absolutely phenomenal. I've watched that episode multiple times, and there's a really good episode on Bjarke Ingels on architecture, where he talks about his unique designs, like a clean power plant with a ski slope on top of it, as well as some of his more recent work in New York City. There's also an episode on automotive design. I found season 1 to be absolutely fascinating. Season 2 just recently came out. I'm also a nerd when it comes to typefaces and very specific fonts. So there's an episode on that. So I was able to nerd out on that. There's also one on digital product design as well. So go to Netflix. I would start in season 1 if you have not seen them before and just binge your way through. They're very thoughtful. They are, as you might suspect, designed very well. I loved it. It's called Abstract, The Art of Design. You can find it on Netflix. Now, if you did receive value from this, please take a quick second and give us a quick review on your favorite podcast player. Those mean more than you know as we try to grow our audience and improve leadership everywhere. And of course, tell all your friends about the Construction Leadership Podcast. Your friends look for you as a leader to understand where they should invest their time and attention. So please help us spread the word. That's it. That's all I've got for you. We're going to close out like we always do with our leadership mantra. You are owed nothing. Deliver value first.